Welcome everyone to this year's A4S Summit. My name is Jessica Friis and I'm the Exec Chair at A4S. It is fantastic to have all of you with us today. This is the 15th year of the A4S Summit and the 15th time we've really brought together the global finance and accounting community to make sustainable business as usual. Of course, this year for the second time, we are bringing everyone together virtually. Now, over the period that A4S has worked, since first established by the Prince of Wales in 2004, we have collectively made significant progress, but there is still a lot, of course, to do. Over the course of the day today, and then through a series of roundtables over the rest of the week, we're going to be exploring the issues we face, including how to tackle the climate and nature crises, create inclusive, equitable and thriving economies. We're going to look at the key developments over the past year, most recently the announcements at COP26, the UN's climate conference, as well as exploring how to translate commitment to action and some of the developments that might help us to accelerate progress, including the role of technology. During this opening session, we're going to hear from a variety of finance leaders who will share their vision for the future, both over the long term and the next 12 months. And we'll discuss the actions that the finance and accounting community needs to take to achieve progress. Discussions will include a bit of a deep dive on Asia Pacific, and I'll say more about that later. But first, I'm delighted to introduce His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales, A4S's founder, to share his opening thoughts through the following message.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'm delighted to welcome you to this, the 15th A4S Summit, held for the second year in virtual form. Our ability to connect across the world through technology has been one of the few silver linings from the past year or two, and one that I am sure will remain. But I do hope that next year we might be able to gather once again in person, allowing the free flow of conversation, a cup of tea, and possibly even a mince pie or two. So, as we look to recover from this pandemic, it is increasingly clear that human health, planetary health, and economic health are fundamentally interconnected. 17 years on from the time I established my Accounting for Sustainability project, A4S, and several decades more since I first started to talk and try to do something about these issues, we simply must seize the current window of opportunity to reimagine our global systems in a way that puts nature, people and planet at the very heart of how we operate. At last year's summit, I talked about the establishment of my Sustainable Markets Initiative and the ways that you, the A4S community, could support its ambitions. Over the course of the past year, I convened a group of international CEOs to help develop a Terra Carta, a practical blueprint for action, and to catalyze the trillions of dollars needed for the transition to a sustainable future. Since then, I'm so delighted and grateful that many of your organizations have stepped forward to sign the Terra Carta. A4S is working with the SMI to contribute the vital skills that you, as finance professionals and accountants, can bring to convert the Terra Carta blueprint into action. A particular focus of this collaboration is the adoption of sustainability accounting, common metrics and standards, an area central to my A4S project since its inception. Now really is the time to move to unified metrics, global standards, and mandatory disclosure. As you all know only too well, there is a movement towards convergence of existing global standards among the standard setters, and that is of huge importance. Most recently, the A4S Foundation has established its International Sustainability Standards Board, and regulators, including within the UK, EU, across Asia and the US, are putting in place mandatory requirements. Developing a single global standard for sustainability reporting will increase consumer trust in the social, environmental and ethical credentials of products and services, and enable investors to channel finance towards sustainable outcomes at the scale so desperately needed. I cannot thank you enough, ladies and gentlemen, for all the effort to which so many of you have devoted your time and energy over the past 2 decades in order to get us to this point. Further, through new technologies, we have the ability to tag, track and trace supply chains in unprecedented ways. So it is time to make this level of transparency the norm. Now, I would like, if I may, to summarize the 6 key actions set out under Article 9 of the Terra Carta that you can take, which will further the ambition and deliver the results required. Firstly, encouraging the continued convergence of standards and reporting towards a single universal framework. This is absolutely critical to accelerating progress towards sustainable markets and a sustainable future. Secondly, supporting the international business, financial and accounting communities to complete the job of establishing a unified, coherent, global system of mainstream reporting of ESG factors in cooperation with regulators and leading voluntary standards. Thirdly, outlining opportunities to enhance global sustainability policy harmonization, integration and coherence. Differences in policy across regions creates distortions in economic activity by changing the incentives of businesses and also increasing corporate costs. The net consequence is lowered productivity and allocation of resources to manage corporate compliance with policy differences, rather than productive activities such as innovation. Fourthly, integrating sustainability into management systems to bring parity of sustainability data with other business metrics, which will help to redefine value measurement and improve decision-making. Fifthly, improving company-wide understanding of sustainability standards, metrics and industry benchmarks, including for board members, employees, shareholders, clients, suppliers and consumers. And finally, focusing on the integration of data to enable sustainable value chains. These efforts aim to enable responsible decision-making, trust and transparency, while creating sustainability metrics at parity with other business data. Ladies and gentlemen, over the coming months, A4S will continue to work with the SMI and its 10 transition alliances to support these actions along the value chains of the highest emitting and polluting industries. Further, A4S is working with members of its global CFO accounting bodies and asset owner networks to develop practical guidance and examples, which I hope will be of assistance to you all. This work will help to showcase examples of the 6 action areas that I have summarized as part of the first annual report showing progress against the Terra Carta. I can only urge you to contribute to this work if you possibly can. Ladies and gentlemen, we are on the cusp of a tipping point where sustainable business might finally become business as usual. The A4S community continues to grow with the newest chapter of the CFO Leadership Network now established in the Asia-Pacific region, and more of you making ambitious commitments as well as putting tangible roadmaps in place. There is no excuse for inaction. Indeed, those who do not act will be left behind. My Accounting for Sustainability project is providing you with the guidance, tools and training required. My only hope is that you can learn from these examples and take heart from the success of the members of the various A4S networks. Ladies and gentlemen, to seize this moment of acceleration, we simply must work together within and across all sectors of the global economy in order to transition rapidly to a sustainable future. It is easy to feel completely overwhelmed by the scale of the challenges we face. Instead, I can only encourage you to roll up your sleeves, set clear, short and long-term plans, and be energized by the opportunities that exist if we work together to create a vibrant, sustainable economy with nature, people and planet at its heart.
So I'd like to thank His Royal Highness very much for sharing those opening thoughts. As he highlighted, we have a lot of work to do, but there has been real progress. And over the course of the day, we'll hear more from some of the members of A4S's networks and really that focus on how we can translate some of the commitments that everyone has been making to action. Up next, we have an interview that I had the pleasure of doing with Pavan Sukhdev. Pavan is a scientist by education. He's an international banker by training and an environmental economist by passion. We first connected a number of years ago when he was leading the United Nations TEEB project, the Economics of Ecosystem and Biodiversity. He's now CEO of GIST, but also president of WWF International and a UNEP Goodwill ambassador. He's based in India, but his work is very much global. So we thought that this would be a fitting start to really set the context and the kind of trends that we face. Before I will be really pleased to introduce some of the CFOs from our new Asia Pacific chapter, which His Royal Highness mentioned we are launching today. So first, I'd like to share those thoughts from Pavan Sukhdev. Pavan, it's fantastic to have you with us for this year's summit, and really looking forward to hearing the discussion and your thoughts. I'd love to get started by setting the context. So we know that we're facing a climate emergency, a nature emergency, and some really significant social challenges around inequality, diversity, equity, inclusion, mental health, talent, a whole range of problems really encapsulated by the Sustainable Development Goals. To get going, what kind of progress do you feel we're making towards those Sustainable Development Goals, or whether it's climate, nature, or some of those social issues?
Well, it's great to be here with you, Jessica, and on a platform which I dearly love, Accounting for Sustainability, and thank you all for taking the early leadership, especially to His Royal Highness, the Prince of Wales, such a long time back, in an area which is clearly central to the solutions to these problems. But I think today my appreciation of where we are is mixed. The Climate Action Tracker does warn us that we are nowhere near the 1.5 degrees level that we would all love to head towards by 2050. That targets like 2.7, which is terrible, are really more like what business as usual based on today, and even whatever commitments are made would lead to. So I think there's clearly work to be done. But at the same time, I mean, I'm encouraged by the action on reduced deforestation that's been achieved, the consensus that's been achieved at Glasgow, and I'm particularly encouraged by the announcement of the International Sustainability Standards Board by the IASB. So there's good things to look forward to.
And in terms of areas to look out for next year, what do some of those, both the announcements and some of those trends mean for the finance community?
We are already at a point, Jessica, where the EU taxonomy and the reporting standards that have been introduced by the EU for the financial institutions are in play. So work's beginning, and I think this will progress further. I think clearly there's a huge endorsement of the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, as if you like a follow through on the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. So measuring impacts and potentially valuing them and reporting them, of course, is very much what the financial community is doing. And I think that takes us to the world of accounting for sustainability. And it takes us to the world where the need to measure and report impacts beyond just financial impacts on shareholders clearly has become accepted. Now we're not, it's not something that is a debate anymore. It's more a question of not whether, it's actually not even a question of what, but it's now becoming more a how question. And that's really, really good progress. So I'm pleased with that right now.
I think that really captures one of the themes that we've been looking at and talking to, taking just that climate dimension. At Glasgow, a huge number of commitments that people had made, as you say, still falling short of where we need them to, but progress. But even more challenging is that conversion of commitment to action. So I'd love to hear from you, your thoughts on, how can the accounting and finance community really take action? Where are some of the practical areas of focus that they can really be leading on? Right.
Well, Jessica, I think we are at a time where what we need to do is to build bridges, and recognize the huge amount of effort that's been engaged already by people like Accounting for Sustainability, by the Value Balancing Alliance, which is a group of 4 major accountancy firms and the Big Four, as well as some leading corporations in sustainability, to create a guideline, if you like, as to how to account for sustainability. How do you measure impacts in the 4 dimensions of capital, being natural capital, human capital, social capital, and of course reduced and financial capital. So this work already is progressing, and I think the challenge now is how do we build bridges between that work and the work that has been kicked off by the International Accounting Standards Board. And I think there's good news, because we can talk more about this in a minute, but if I look at the ISSB's 8 deliverables, I can see at least 3, if not 4 of them, where there are opportunities to build bridges between their world of creating standards and the efforts that's been engaged by the Natural Capital Coalition, by Accounting for Sustainability, by the Value Balancing Alliance, and of course by groups such as the Value Reporting Foundation, which are already absorbed as part of the ISB's initiative, which was announced in Glasgow. So I think there's work in each of these, and we can go into more detail.
So I'd love to hear where you feel that bridge is, because of course the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, has said that their focus is enterprise value. Now, whether it's something like climate change, whether it's something like nature, you touched on the TNFD, or some of those the social and human capital dimensions, we know you've been talking about impacts. And when you're talking about impacts, that you have the impact that some of those issues have on the organization and its success. That's of course what the ISSB is focused on. But also to tackle some of these issues, it is about the impact that an organization has in economics terms, that externality. And as an economist yourself, that's clearly the kind of language you're very familiar with. So how can some of those frameworks, those bridges be built to help organizations to really be able to look at those 2 dimensions and think about the impact that they have on the world, as well as how some of those risks and opportunities associated with issues will impact them?
Well, I think there are bridges to be built, and let me comment on 3 bridges which seem apparent to me. So what we have right now was published at Glasgow was the list of the 8 deliverables of the International Sustainability Standards Board. And the first one is a kind of general requirements prototype, which is available for public comment. And in that, they do very clearly talk about users' assessment. So they're talking about the need for investors to assess enterprise value after accounting for some of the risks. In other words, some of the costs of future losses, or the costs of losing market share to bad sustainability practices, or for that matter, losing assets because they've become stranded assets. So these are elements of risk which I think are real, and they've been brought into the picture. And I quote, I mean, we're talking about decisions that, this is from their materiality paragraph in the general requirements prototype. They talk about, I'm quoting, decisions that the primary users of the entity's general purpose financial reports make on the basis of these reports. So again, talking our language, if you like. And they talk about assessments of the entity's enterprise value after accounting for all of this sustainability information and risk information. So this already is there. And then in terms of their general disclosure requirements, they're talking about very much the language of TCFD in terms of governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. And again, when we say metrics and targets, well, of course, you know, the numeraire matters. What is the numeraire that you're going to set for metrics and targets when the thing that you're measuring is not just climate impacts, but it's also water scarcity, it's also air pollution, it's also the loss of nature and biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So you need to look at a common numeraire, as any economist would do. So these are opportunities, I think. So that's, if you like, bridge number one on their general reporting requirements framework. Then on climate, as expected, because TNFD is part of their community, surely they have introduced the usual 4 stages of governance and strategy and risk assessment, and of course metrics and targets. So that's very much, again, where we can feed in metrics and targets. And when we talk about the architecture of the standards, it looks like TCFD, TNFD, and the I'm not sure what to call them. I guess they haven't been named as yet, but I would love to see them call it the International Impact Reporting Standards, the IIS, the International Impact Report, IRS, if you like. I mean, today the ISB standards are IFRS. So what I'm seeing is that, well, maybe the ISSB will have a set of standards which are called the International Impact Reporting Standards, IIRS. Let's see what happens. But the third point I'll make is that they have an entire deliverable which is on connectivity. Now that's very good news. So that's their deliverable number 8. And what they talk about in terms of connectivity between IASB and ISSB means that they have to create standards which reflect some of the structure and some of the architecture of the IFRS. And again, they will come up straight away on the issue of how do you find trade-offs? How do you define trade-offs? How do you measure trade-offs? And then how do you value trade-offs? And I think that's very much the language that Accounting for Sustainability and the Natural Capital Coalition, and indeed the Value Reporting Foundation would love to see adopted. So I'm optimistic that the working groups that they've set up will have at least 3 important the technical readiness working groups, as they're calling them, would have at least 3 important touch points within the framing of their own proposition to the world where work has already begun on measuring impacts, valuing impacts, and integrating reporting.
Fantastic. And I think that, as you highlighted, the fact that the Value Reporting Foundation, which came out of the International Integrated Reporting Council and SASB, the Sustainability Accounting Standards, but lots of acronyms, but all of them merging together, so it'll make everyone's life a little bit easier. But with that integrated reporting framework, which was based on that concept of impacts and dependencies, and that those different capitals, and really that idea of the need to build that bridge between the financial reporting world and the sustainability reporting world. Hopefully that will see things in and sort of standing in good stead. I'd like to come on to that question of nature now. We first connected, I think, many years ago when you were working, leading some of the UN's work on how do you really measure, value, understand that whole question of ecosystems and biodiversity and the economic dependence that we have, as well as the human dependence, of course, on nature, on the planet. You mentioned the TNFD, the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosures, And I think that for the finance and accounting world, this is an area where over the coming 12 months, everyone really needs to get to grips with and get much more comfortable understanding what some of those risks are, the opportunities for solutions, and how they can respond. But I think it's an area that feels a lot further behind in terms of climate and that understanding, that familiarity. So can you say a little bit from your, how can organizations really go up that learning curve? Are there certain things that they can do to really understand some of those nature related impacts and dependencies?
Sure, I think that's an important point that you raised. And yes, of course, I do remember our early days in doing the TEEB project, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, which, if I may remind people, is that even then, 2010, in fact, 2008, we published estimates of economic loss between $2.5 to $4 trillion as a result of the global business as usual loss of forests that was going on in those days. And of late, and very recently, the WWF and their collaborators have published a report which talks about something like a $10 trillion loss cumulative to 2050 on just the loss of protected areas, just protected areas, and 6 ecosystem services emanating from those protected areas. So the sheer sort of size of the economic losses that are happening as a result of this is basically lost productivity and increased risk, essentially due to increased emissions, lack of capture of carbon, emissions of carbon, loss of freshwater, nutrients losses, and so on and so forth, which come as a result of forest losses. All of these are huge economic costs, and we need to acknowledge them. And I think the Task Force for Nature-Related Financial Disclosure would be well advised to bring that information into its templates. But I think also there's a challenge ahead for the TNFD, because among others, the ISSB itself will be relying upon certain standards as to how do you define biodiversity? What is it? And it's essentially the living fabric of this planet. But of course, it exists in 3 layers. It's ecosystems and their diversity and their scale. It's species and their diversity and their many values they provide to humanity. And then finally, it's genetic diversity, which is something for which gives resilience to and provides a foundation for human health, long-term human health on this planet. So I think there's all the 3 dimensions of biodiversity, if you like, that need to be considered by the TNFD, and I'm sure they will. But I'd say that, the work on ecosystem services, thanks to the more recent work by Professor Partha Dasgupta and earlier work by TEEB and many others who contributed towards this. And of course, Professor Dasgupta has been writing on this for the last 4 decades. And people like you and I have been reading his work. So there's a lot here on the ecosystem side, ecosystem services. And thankfully now there's enough data already which can be brought in for species diversity. Genetic diversity is work to do. And this is an open space, which I hope research will lead to. But I think the TNFD, in summary, needs to pick on ecosystem layers, species layers, and genetic layers, bring them into the framework, and recognize that it's a multi-stage process. We can't today have enough to say on the economic value of all 3, but we certainly do have a lot to say on the former, a little bit less perhaps on species diversity, but quite enough. And I guess work to do on genetic diversity. So these are aspects which I'm hoping that the TNFD brings into play, which will be wonderful because that will give the ISSB the means to rely on some consensus framing of the idea of these values and these costs.
Yeah, and I think that's, as you say, I think that really important framing and bridge. And then also, I ought to mention the GRI Global Reporting Initiative is doing some of that deep dive work on what kind of metrics, how do you actually bring together a standard around biodiversity. So I think some complementary efforts which will hopefully help. Now, one of the things that we're launching as part of the summit is our latest chapter of our CFO Leadership Network based in Asia Pacific. Now, of course, you're based in India normally. I'd love to get your thoughts on the biggest contribution you think that grouping of CFOs from the region can make to tackling some of these challenges that we've been talking about.
Well, firstly, let me congratulate you and thank you for starting this, because it's a really important bridge. Again, another bridge that has to be built with the world of the C-suite from the finance side. And to be honest, we're talking about CFOs, we're talking about chief controllers, and so on. And as the time comes, and it's already here with us, when CEOs have to look at management information systems and look at management information on how sustainable is my company, what are its impacts on natural and human and social capital, and how do I compare versus benchmarks for my sector, and so on and so forth. Yeah, sure. I mean, they might be interested in what their chief sustainability officer has to say about it, but honestly, as a typical CEO, they would first ask their chief financial officer, can you please give me MIS on all of this additional dimension of impact of our company, and can you please make sure it aligns to global standards, and what are these standards, and can I have some information from you on how does this work within my sector. The focus of the CEO's inquiry will be answered, in my opinion, not by the chief sustainability officer, but by the chief financial officer. So my message to our CFO friends, and I've already started messaging this across to those, and I'd love to do so with your community as well, is that, look, your work is expanding and the size of your job is increasing. So that's the good news. The bad news is it's more work and you'll have to do it. So, please get ready for it and embrace it with alacrity and speed.
Yeah, I'll be interested to see what their reflections are. But I have to say, the feedback we get from the CFOs in the network so far is that it's an area that their teams really enjoy and value getting involved in. And so in terms of motivation, engagement, retention, some real positives. So if they're needing to grow their team to bring in some of the skills in this area, definitely an area where they from experience won't struggle to recruit.
Yeah, I think I look forward to the enthusiasm and speed that I know we need in this space, and I believe we get it, and that's very good to hear. Yes.
Yeah, and I think clearly that collaboration with the sustainability experts in the organization as well, but combined with finance bringing that rigor, that discipline, that the ability to really invest and drive action across the organization could be a really powerful partnership.
Exactly. Yeah.
We're nearly out of time, Pavan, so I'd love to just ask one final question, and I appreciate this is probably the most challenging question. If there's one single action that you think the finance and accounting community really needs to be focusing on over the coming 12 months to achieve the greatest progress against the Sustainable Development Goals, what is that action?
That's really interesting. I would say if there is one single action that the finance community, led by the CFOs and the chief controllers that you in the Accounting for Sustainability Network are engaging, I would frame it thus: that please ask the standard setters and please ask your CEOs to insist upon reporting in a language that you understand. And the language that you understand is the language of finance. You understand economic value. That's where you come from. And thankfully, today, the availability of data and the technology, the systems architectures, and the systems for working things out in terms of valuation, that ability has grown exponentially. I'm saying this as a practitioner, even in the time that I've been involved in the last 15 years. It's really grown incredibly. And so therefore, their ask should be that, please, let's agree on standards and frameworks where impacts can be measured in economic value terms. And of course, there are all kinds of impacts, which go beyond economics, and that's fine. But those that are available and measurable in economic terms should be standardized. And that should become the additional layer, the additional envelope, if you like, that the ISSP builds over the IASP. And basically, that should be the international impact reporting standards, which would be the outer envelope of the current international financial reporting standards. I think if that can be their one ask, that would be actually a very powerful ask, and that's what I recommend to them.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Pavan, for those really broad insights. And I'm really looking forward to how the CFOs and our other speakers throughout the day respond to some of the challenges you've set out and some of the suggested actions.
Thanks, Jessica. Great to talk with you, and all the best for you.
So that was wonderful to hear from Pavan, and I think a few wise words, but also some challenges to throw out to the CFO and wider finance and accounting community. So next, I'm really pleased to introduce a number of speakers who are here to talk about that role of the CFO, and in particular mark the launch of the Asia Pacific chapter of A4S's CFO Leadership Network. As many of you will know, the A4S CFO Leadership Network is a really unique grouping of over 60 CFOs from large organizations now. Collectively, they represent $20.7 trillion of combined total assets, and with a commercial presence in every corner of the globe. And so I think that real opportunity to be leading and driving change. And of course, CFOs have that role of controlling the flows of money, providing the kind of data needed to inform decisions, support integration across the business. And the members of our network really work together and with their teams and the wider finance and accounting community to make sustainable business as usual, use their position to influence and inspire others to act, and produce some of the practical approaches and guidance that I think we're all looking for to enable action to happen. Now, of course, I'm particularly pleased to be welcoming some of these CFOs to our global leadership network and to be formally launching a chapter in Asia Pacific. Countries across the region are really at the front line of many of the social, economic, and environmental challenges that the world faces. Taking just climate and some of the impacts, 11 of the top 20 countries experiencing the greatest level of GDP impact from the key risks of extreme weather and adaptive capacity are all in the region. The top 5 are all APEC countries. And for many economies in the region, they're also, of course, grappling to lift many of their populations out of poverty while achieving net zero emissions and the transition associated with that. Finally, and of course, this is far from least, many of the organizations in the region really are at the heart of the innovations and provide many of the opportunities and the solutions that we need. So I am really pleased to introduce 4 members from that Asia Pacific chapter who will share some of their thoughts and potentially respond to some of those challenges that Pavan mentioned, and of course, His Royal Highness. So first of all, Rishi Kalra. Rishi is the Executive Director and Group CFO of Olam Food Ingredients and co-chair of the chapter. He's been working with us for many years through our Singapore Circle of Practice. Secondly is Shay Cabell-Revilla, the CFO and Chief Sustainability Officer, and I believe Chief Risk Officer, so 3 in 1, from Metro Pacific Investments Corporation, headquartered in the Philippines. Next, Mark Rivers, CFO of Fonterra, based in New Zealand. And last but not least, Martin Roberts. Martin is the CFO of Ramsay Healthcare, headquartered in Australia. Now, if you have any questions for our panel, please do share these as we go, and we'll try and cover as many as we can during the discussion. So welcome, everyone. I'm really looking forward to hearing all of your insights that you can share. Now, I'd like to get going by picking up on that question of climate change. So we've just had COP26, it was a couple of weeks ago now, and the focus, of course, on accelerating global climate action. So Rishi, if I could come to you first, as a CFO, what do you think were the key announcements from COP26? And as CFOs and finance teams, what are the key things that people need to be taking note of, and you know, what does that mean for the kind of work that the chapter might focus on?
Thank you, Jessica, and delighted to be here. It's always a pleasure being at the summit, while it is happening virtually this year, but it is equally important that all of us take back a lot that will be discussed over the course of the next few days. And I was actually very delighted with what His Royal Highness spoke about and Pawan specifically on areas that CFOs and finance need to focus upon. It's also very heartening that most of this is now coming together. While we've all been this journey for at different points and different times, but it is all coming together, whether it is the standard setters or even CEOs seeking what they need to from the CFOs. So I think this is a good time for the launch of the Asia Pacific chapter as well, for us to take this forward. Now, coming to your specific question on COP and how it impacts finance and CFOs, as we all would have heard, there were many key announcements made, and there were, whether it was the 85% world's forest loss reserve reverse or the protecting world's ocean by 2030, there's clear focus on many commitments to transforming the global economy to net zero, which alone, in my belief, would bring immense shifts throughout the world. And I see it in achieving this commitment, companies and corporates will have to really play a critical role in advancing climate action by decarbonizing their own operations and manufacturing facilities to the next generation technology as well, to ensure that we can help avoid GHG emissions as we go forward. And like Pawan was saying, this is, while it is all good to say, it is for the companies to deliver, but the reality of this will come down to dollars and cents and numbers. And that is where every chain that every business will need to deliver upon will have to be deep driven, and finance will have to play a critical role in doing that, whether it is in budgeting, capital allocation, setting KPIs, and last but not the least, in ensuring data governance and assurance. So all that is going to be absolutely critical in the heart of where CFOs and finance need to step up now. And it will be adopting the same level of, as I see it, rigor and robustness to ESG data as we have been doing it to finance data for over so many years. So it is really intertwining. It is all going to be coming down to data governance, assurance, ensuring that numbers can be reflected in a language that people can understand. And for me, that is very simple, dollars and cents. It could be different currencies, but it's really about a currency that is well understood by accountants and businesses and investors and the whole community at large. So for me, that really is going to be the biggest key area where finance teams will have to really step up, put in controls and processes to both manage, govern, and report. And last but not the least, a big takeaway was from a finance standpoint, was A4S Foundation's announcement of setting up of ISSB. It is a watershed moment because it really brings it all together. This is the moment that many organizations, corporates, and finance community has been seeking out for. By bringing some standard setters together, ensuring that there is common understanding and a language that everybody will appreciate. Again, something that His Royal Highness touched upon and Pawan also mentioned. I see this really a very good time. We think everything is coming together. And likewise, like I mentioned in my start, from an A4S APAC chapter setup, this is really an opportune moment. It is where there's heightened focus, both on reporting. In some places, it is becoming mandated as well. And all of us in the Asia Pacific chapter and region can learn from what is already happening in the rest of the world. So we don't need to necessarily reinvent the wheel. There is already enough that is there to take. We can at the same time adapt and adopt to our own requirements because there could be certain nuances that comes along with what the region faces. So we can also shape up some of these policies, add back and provide inputs to the larger A4S bodies and the standard setters as well. So for me, this is really important from two perspectives. Like I said, it is about the role that finance has to play. It is all coming together very well. And all of us as CFOs in this group and beyond are really not just delighted, but I think lucky to be on this journey at the right and important time.
Fantastic. Thank you, Rishi. Shay, if I could come to you next. Now, Metro Pacific, you own a whole portfolio of different types of industries from across a pretty wide variety of sectors, and based in the Philippines. So I'd love to hear a bit more from you about again some of those dimensions around climate, but particularly thinking of resilience as well. Now, of course, we know that we're already going to suffer from some of the impacts of global warming. Unless we take urgent action, that's going to get worse. So I'd love to hear more about some of the work that you're doing to really build more resilience into what an organization does.
Thank you, Jessica, and for the opportunity to be part of this summit. For Metro Pacific, given the essential nature of our businesses, as you can see in my background here, we are into power, water, transportation infrastructure, which includes toll roads and railway, healthcare, among others, right? Everything that we do has a pervasive impact in our country and the people and the communities that we serve. This is why, from a sustainability strategy standpoint, we have tried to pivot from mere risk management to overall business resilience, which actually include climate resilience that you mentioned earlier. Apart from us fortifying our network operations and making sure that we provide continuous service across all our businesses, because again, they're necessary services, I can probably think of several resiliency strategies. One would be accelerating our climate investments, which include our transition to renewables across all our operating entities. Also investing into waste management projects, which is also in my background here, such as the biogas plants using anaerobic technology in relation to our decarbonization plan. Next would be pushing for digitalization across our organization as an adaptation mechanism with the many uncertainties that we face. As an example, no, we have a prolonged health crisis. We actually launched MWell, our integrated health and wellness platform, to make sure that people are given access to healthcare wherever they may be, given the mobility restrictions here in the Philippines in various areas, and also given the COVID virus mutations, right? Another one would be collaborating with government agencies and key alliance groups to help protect our natural resources and biodiversities. We just entered into a partnership with ACB, that's the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity, because we all know that protecting nature as natural carbon sinks is actually equally important as reducing carbon emissions as well. And lastly, to your question on building resilience for the people here in the Philippines, because we're not as progressive as everybody else, we actually have specific sustainability-linked advocacies, including capacity building relating to livelihood, education, health, environment, community development. Because we believe that enabling, the poorer segments and then the smaller businesses, SMEs, and communities is really, really essential to our survival and sustainability, not just of our business, but of the country. Because when everyone thrives, it benefits us all, right? Including all of us.
Fantastic. Thank you, Shay. Mark, I'd like to come to you next. And one of the other themes that Pavan, of course, referenced was nature. And in the industry you're in the sector you're in, that's of course critical to both, of course, the financial stability of the organization, the success. And we know that there is a dramatic fall in some of in species extinction, and in terms of some of those ecosystems that Pavan mentioned are reducing rapidly. So for a business like Fonterra, can you say what that means and how finance can really get to grips with some of that collapse in biodiversity and ecosystems, particularly from the lens of a CFO?
Yeah, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, I mean, I think as a finance community, we're very familiar with measuring outputs and inputs, and I like to say what gets measured gets managed. Sort of take from that perspective. But I think probably in the past we've probably just been thinking too narrowly and only along financial terms. And I think the key to unlock this is to think very holistically on both sides of the equation. Actually, first of all, on the outputs. So what is it that our industry is producing? What is that benefit to society? In our case, it's about producing food and nutrition. So what is that? How do we measure that in a holistic way as possible? But then likewise on the inputs, what are the inputs needed to generate that output? Not just the cost, but also the environmental impact and all of that. And so I think that's really the key to unlocking it is to go down that path. And then the second piece of it is once you've got sort of those metrics in place, and there's always a path to improve that, is then how do you build this into the decision-making process, right? So when it comes to allocating investments and all of that, you want to do investments which improve those outputs, but also which improve those inputs, but ecological as well. So one of the things we've done in our cooperative along these lines is to create a program called Cooperative Difference, where we really look end to end, including all the way back to our suppliers, and to create some incentives basically for them to implement their environmental plans. And so it's designing environmental plans that take all these factors into account, but then also make it real by by measuring and showing metrics and giving incentives to improve. Because at the end of the day, it's really end to end. We have to think holistically, in order to make an impact. And when we do that, then we're going to be creating value, right? And that's really the path. There's an example of a farm in Northland, Andrew and Vicky Booth, and they've been using their farm environment plan specifically to prioritize improvements on farm and tracking progress. And they actually were part of a pilot of looking at farm-specific greenhouse gas reports that were tailored to their specific farm. And that's something that we can roll out actually to all farmers. So it's really about measuring. What you measure, you can manage.
Thanks, Mark. Martin, I'd like to bring you in next and ask you to pick up some of those social challenges that we're facing now. Of course, at the moment we're still in the grips of the pandemic. Latest developments in terms of emerging concern on the latest variants. As a healthcare company operating globally, how have the last couple of years really impacted how you do business, and how can some of those social challenges really be incorporated by CFOs into the heart of decision making?
Yeah, no, thanks, Jessica, and thanks for the opportunity. Well, look, I mean, as you said, we are in a lot of different countries, and we've seen all sorts of different outcomes from the pandemic, from Australia to the UK and France. But I think everywhere that we've seen the immediate focus for us, like all companies, probably was the safety of our patients, our doctors, and our staff. At Ramsay, we have the Ramsay Way, people caring for people. That really proved the importance of culture when you get put through a lot of pressure that our teams have been through, and that really held people together during that time. Having said that, that pressure and the exhaustion and the emotional drain of dealing with the pandemic for almost 2 years has created a huge increase in the shortage of healthcare workers globally. So, for example, in France, 20% of the beds in the public system are unoccupied currently due to staff shortages. And it's not just isolated to France. In the US, it's a big issue. So that's been a real challenge for us, and something that we really need to address in terms of being a lot stronger in terms of the way that we not only recruit but retain our staff as well, and create the best workforce. And for me, sustainability is just about as much about our own people as it is about the environment and all those other things. So a focus on people, I think, is one of the key learnings. Obviously, there's been a rapid increase in technology, so the use of telehealth, those kind of things. So technology and the role that CFOs play in pushing forward and supporting and driving some of those initiatives is really important. We've seen a massive increase in relationships with governments over this time. The private healthcare system has really proven that we're an important part of the country's healthcare systems that we operate in, and so government relations is something that we're all having to get much more focused on and involved in. But of course, relevant to this conversation, it hasn't stopped the increase in focus of shareholders, etc., and financiers on sustainability. So that's been increased dramatically, and from our people as well. So we just did a $1.5 billion sustainability linked loan as part of our refinancing, and we'll continue to do things like that. So I think it's for CFOs, the key learning is, I mean, none of us could have predicted the pandemic, so I'm not sure anyone had it in their risk registers before we went into this. It's certainly on there now, but I think focusing on all those aspects, particularly around people, I think is one of the key things that we're all going to have to. People and technology, I'd say, the key learnings coming out of it.
Fantastic, thanks, Mark and Martin. And yeah, I think more challenges in the year ahead, and as you say, at a point where people are already incredibly stretched, and that mental strain really starting to toll. And that point on staff shortages, of course, really impacting a business like yours, but that's certainly something that is of course impacting across many sectors, so a real challenge. Rishi, there has been a lot of focus on a number of these different issues that we've covered today. And a sustainable future is really dependent on inclusive, sustainable growth. Now, you were talking about climate earlier, but of course, as our other speakers have highlighted, it stretches across a really wide range of different impacts and issues. Through your value chain, you work very closely in a lot of emerging economies, developing countries and communities. And so I'd love to hear how Olam Food Ingredients is working with some of those farmers in different parts of the world, and how as a CFO you can really balance some of those complex issues of delivering products at an affordable price whilst supporting local livelihoods.
Thanks, Jessica. That's absolutely important and very critical. It's not just about climate, it is also about many other things that need to go right and hand in hand. And in my view, I actually believe that ensuring the sustainability of a company's financial performance lies in creating shared value across all stakeholders, and which include farmers. And for us as a company and a business that we are in, they are actually essential to us. They are so critical to our existence in itself. We work so closely with the smallholder farmers and communities, and that is where the supply chain really starts. So if anybody really needs the provenance, we need to have that smallholders, farmers, and communities are really working and empowered to make it happen. And as a CFO and in finance, I actually believe very strongly, and there is enough proof points now, that doing good more often than not actually creates value. It is not that they are independent of each other. While it might seem as cost from one lens, but they actually are investment for the future if you see it from a business perspective. And that is when it becomes embedded, because once you see that value flowing through, you do invest more. And then they don't seem any more cost from a financial lens, the way we've been used to seeing some of these numbers. And as an organization, as OFI, one of the key material areas that we focus upon is economic opportunity, and on which we are highly committed as well across ensuring that we are providing decent wages and income for farmers, alongside other key social aspects of ESG too. And we are absolutely clear that providing decent fair wages, which is income that covers beyond basic needs of food, water, housing, education, healthcare, transport, and clothing, allows for also unexpected cost, which goes beyond minimum wage. So it is not about minimum wages. It is about really paying fair wages. And that is what and how you can get people involved and engaged more. And for us, if the farmers are doing and are running a good family livelihood, get basic needs properly, they will function better, and they'll also give us better productivity and yields. So again, it all comes back to value. And once that distinction goes away and people are able to form that strong linkage, you start investing much more. And we really invest into a farmer's livelihood in a very different way. For us, like I mentioned earlier, they are actually the backbone of ensuring a sustainable food ingredients supply chain, which is really the heart of what we do as a company. And I'm fairly clear that the responsible action that we are taking have actually helped us in making our business more resilient. So just reiterating that, it's an important piece. And once you do it, and we started over there. So as an organization, we didn't start from manufacturing side. We started very close to the farmer. We started from the farm gate, and I've been taking it to the other end. And our ability to understand, appreciate their needs and requirements has helped us in building a business which is far more resilient in times like today. And the other aspect that you also touched upon is the poverty or zero hunger. That is equally important because it is not only about the farmers and the communities that you work with. It is we are industry that can also has to ensure that food is coming through and supplied. And we are all aware that there are more than 820 million people who go to bed without food. And if the numbers that talk about, there are 2 billion of people might be there by 2050. So we need to really work upon food security. We have to find innovative solutions which will help us in our industry, not just paying the right thing, but also ensuring that there is food availability at the lowest cost without seeping into too much resources, because resources are scarce. We are aware that we cannot really lead into and deploy much more than we have. So it is a balance that you have to draw, and that is where science will really come together very well. I'd also like to call out, as Olam, we actually recently launched Green Pass. It is a part of Olam Ventures. It's a holistic platform to help corporates measure, monitor, manage, and verify the impact of their actions and strategies. So for me, as a company, it has given us insights, and that is what every finance organization, CFOs, and corporates will have to look at. That how do you ensure that doing good can also create value? And once that clarity comes across, whether it is about zero hunger or working and providing the right livelihoods, will only make your business much more resilient.
Fantastic, thank you, Rishi. I think that some of the comments you've made there and building on the earlier contributions from everyone else, I think that whole question of how CFOs really can help to balance and bring together a lot of these different issues and drive holistic decision making. So I'd like to dig in a bit more in terms of some of the specifics of the role of the CFO. And we've had a few questions on some of these themes as well. So I'll definitely be weaving those through. Mark, if I come to you first, can you say a bit more about some of the actions, the advice you would give to those from the finance community in terms of how they can really embed ESG into decision making, and specifically thinking of the finance team, what they can do?
Yeah, well, I think probably a number of things, but one is not to put sustainability in some different bucket, and instead we should be taking a very integrated approach here. And to be very practical about it, it means that, in our monthly review of the results and in our forecasting and all of that is not only look at the financial numbers, but look at all the other ESG targets that we've set for ourselves, how we're progressing, so that it's very natural and normal that it would feel incomplete almost to review the business if we didn't look at all those other dimensions as well, right? So that's the first advice, is be integrated in thinking. And then, of course, look for how do you construct and build these things into incentive systems and all of that. So to be very comprehensive, end to end through the supply chain as well. And I think this frontier of how to incorporate into decision making is actually very interesting, because that's something probably we're just now trying to understand a lot more, is sort of the behavioral science combination with economics, right? Is how do you actually influence behavior and decision making in a creative way through understanding how do we actually make decisions, and how do we incentivize human beings to choose the higher self sort of outcomes, right? To do what's best for that equation that we talked about earlier.
Yeah, and certainly that whole question of, I guess, the behavioural side. When we first started our CFO Leadership Network, a lot of the guidance was really focused on some of those technical areas. But that whole question of finance culture really came to the fore, and how we can achieve that shift. Shay, I'd love to get your thoughts on this point, because, of course, your role combines that CFO and the Chief Sustainability Officer role. I'd like to hear what you think that helps you to do differently, and whether you see any difference in terms of the cultures of the teams that you're bringing together under that CFO, CSO umbrella. Are there things that the finance professionals can really learn from their sustainability colleagues, and vice versa?
For us in MPIC, our approach is, an inclusive approach. So like every time we have sustainability meetings, we also ask our finance group to join in, and vice versa, right? So there is really no conflict. There's really, to Mark's point, an integration and more synergy. It sort of expanded the understanding and the learnings of the people inside. And my role as CFO and CSO was actually, I think, a blessing in disguise, right? Because it gave me the opportunity to push, for changes, the needed changes in the organization in terms of a lot of things, thinking, processes, etc. Because we know that we CFOs here have the distinct advantage of being at the center of all important business matters, right? And therefore, we can also be catalysts for change in our respective organizations. So both roles have actually allowed me to marry profit and purpose all together, which has also allowed me and our teams to have a holistic view and an end-to-end approach of our thinking, our ways of doing, maybe our strategic actions moving forward. So from where I stand, our imperatives include, again, a holistic approach on EESG, that's economic covering finance, plus ESG covering sustainability. Also, having both CFO and CSO hats, it sort of made things easier for me to operationalize everything. Because when we started sustainability in the broad organization as a group, right, people were asking whether it was, important or necessary 5-10 years ago, and that it was just going to be very expensive. My being CSO and CFO allowed me to put numbers into our sustainability initiatives, including the determination of opportunities and risks, right? To, again, Mark's point earlier, setting and monitoring KPIs that promote accountability for all, with the defined EESG aspects that we have that affect our bottom line and ultimately our shareholder value, our share price, etc. Maybe the last thing I would like to share is that apart from the derived efficiencies on having both roles, was that it was easier to seamlessly integrate finance and sustainability from a story standpoint, because as CFOs, we tell the story of the company through numbers, right? So again, it was easier for us to combine our annual financial reporting with our sustainability reporting to an integrated report, which again covers the holistic end-to-end approach of ESG and being able to map all our initiatives in respect to our contribution to the overall UN SDGs. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Shay. Martin, I'd like to ask you to talk from the perspective of your work engaging the investor audience. So one of the other key roles that we haven't really touched on, we've talked about a little bit in terms of the reporting role that CFOs have, but of course CFOs often also interface with the market. How are you seeing that changing in terms of the kind of questions you're getting asked, the kind of demand for ESG information?
Yeah, well, it's interesting sitting here in Australia, because over the last 5 years, I've probably seen that the Australian sort of fund managers society has probably been at least 3 years behind where Europe has been. You get on a plane and come to London and it's a completely different conversation with investors, but it's all moving at the same pace. And so it continues to drive forward and become a much larger conversation. I fully agree with what Shay just said in terms of trying to integrate the sustainability story with the investment story. It's becoming much more integrated now. We just recently launched our Ramsey Care sustainability strategy, and it's in all our financial reporting. We're having Investor Day coming up next week, and it sits firmly, squarely in that. We've got 3 pillars around caring for our people, our planet, and our communities. And everything we're trying to do from a financial perspective and financial reporting perspective, we're trying to link back to that strategy, and it sits squarely in our overarching strategy as well. So those 2 stories, they're not separate at all. They are completely integrated. And so, but it's not just investors. I mean, our doctors, our staff, our financiers, everybody wants to be more focused on what's happening in the investment in sustainability. I think it was a webinar that you had actually maybe a month or 2 ago. There was a great slide there that showed how chief sustainability officers talk about sustainability, and there was like some pictures and case studies and how investors receive sustainability information, and it was just a Reuters screen. And I think that's something as CFOs we have to really try and remember and make it easier for people to understand. One of our key investors said to us recently, just tell us the 4 things that you're really focused on. It's quite hard to find them in your 500-page impact report. So I think keeping the story simple but really compelling is really important for us.
No, I think that that's some yeah, good advice, and certainly in the enhancing investor engagement discussions that we had, I think that how sustainability can really be a golden thread, joining the dots, came through really clearly. And of course all of that work on integrated reporting, I think is a good start. We'll definitely be deep diving on some of those investor and reporting questions throughout the rest of the day. I'd like to bring in one of the questions from the audience, so from Mark. And he is interested in specifically how you're internalizing the cost of carbon. This is, of course, something that we have looked at through a lot of the guides, so the strategic planning budgeting guide, the CapEx guide. Rishi, I know that this is something that you at Olam Food Ingredients have been thinking about, of how to really integrate that cost of carbon into decision making. Can you say more about your thinking around carbon prices, whether that's something that you have incorporated? Sure.
Thanks, Jessica. Yeah, so we, as you are aware, so we had we started looking at we set together what we call now our integrated impact statement. It was in some ways what Pawan had alluded to. It was looking beyond financial capital. And we started looking at natural, human, and social capital and the impacts and the currency, similar currency dollars and cents of that to the business going forward. And as part of the natural capital work that we did look at the proxy cost of carbon as well, because it is an important piece. So it is something for us to be aware of. And when we evaluate our businesses internally, when we look at what it means, we try to look at beyond financial capital, look at all the action that we're taking and what it reflects in not just the current scenario, but how the future might look like, which is where carbon was introduced. So we have been factoring it for our internal review mechanisms. And some of our case studies are also published on our website, which talk about how did we go about it, what reference points we take. And there's enough learning now, and including the work that A4S has done, there is enough learning for all of us to take back on how it can be adopted. And the way to see this is this could become a real cost in the future. So it's better to start appreciating, understanding the implications thereof to your business today. And even if it becomes a cost later, you know how to manage and navigate through and make your business much more stronger for the future. But yes, to your point, we have been looking at it. We do some proxy costing, but more for internal evaluation purposes.
Great, and certainly I think that that's something that there's quite a big focus on. So definitely recommend anyone who hasn't tried it to think about how that internal cost of carbon, but not just carbon, thinking about it in terms of some of those other issues, can be a really great way to drive that through into decision making. Another question that we've had is around the whole question of data. And again, this is something that I suspect we'll be coming back to through a lot of the sessions today. With those developments in reporting that we've touched on, the International Sustainability Standards Board, a shift to mandatory reporting, and a lot of that reporting requiring insight along the full value chain. So it's not even just the data within your own organizations, it's having that full understanding. Who would like to say a little bit more? Anyone want to come in there in terms of how, are there some additional insights you could share on how you've really got the data piece, and maybe where some of the remaining challenges are? Shay, maybe I could ask you to come in. You've got a very diverse set of businesses, so I suspect particularly challenging.
Yeah, let me try to answer that question. You know, the triple bottom line, the triple piece, right, for sustainability reporting is profit, people, and planet. And I always say we need a fourth P, which is platform. Because at the end of the day, we all have these ERP systems, right, SAP, Oracle, and the likes for financial reporting. But unfortunately for sustainability reporting, because it's relatively new, we don't really have a robust platform yet that we can all use, right? Which is very key because we do have targets also to take a look at. So I think that's essential because right now, admittedly, we try to automate it, but it's really manumatic. It's really more manual, putting together the report and information more than anything. And as much as we want to digitalize and automate it, no system has everything that we all need, right? So I think that's a call for these IT guys to help develop a useful platform for all of us to use.
Yeah, and again, there's a session later on technology, so I'll make sure that I throw that question out, because I agree. I think that technology has to be part of the answer, and digitization to make it a lot easier. And we've had a question from Julie about the whole financial planning process and integration into the budget and 5-year plan. Now, for a lot of organizations with December year ends, or potentially for others, they'll be really in the heart of that budgeting planning process at the moment. So I'd love to hear from anyone who has any thoughts on how do you really embed into the budget, into the 5-year plan. Are the metrics equally prominent in terms of that process? Who would like to come in on that? Martin?
Yeah, well, I mean, forecasting anything at the moment is pretty challenging with the pandemic. Every time you start a forecast, you rip it up and start again. But looking further beyond that, what's interesting is that, we would traditionally run a 3-year business plan, and yet in our sustainability linked loan, we've got 5-year and 7-year sustainability targets. So we've already got targets that we've got to hit across 5 different metrics. And so they are there in the plan, and it's more around now making sure we've got the capex and the resources in the business plan to make sure we can deliver on those commitments. That's really the kind of orientation of the way that we're thinking about it. So in terms of the impacts of climate change and our forecasting, it's not something that's very sophisticated in our business at the moment, and that's something I'd love to learn from others in terms of how they're factoring it in. For example, in our business, if you look at to 2030, what's the impact of climate change going to be on illnesses and presentation of people at hospitals, etc. Trying to find that kind of data is pretty challenging. So I think it's something we all probably need to get more sophisticated at and start thinking about more. But right now it's kind of forecasting how do we actually deliver on our sustainability commitments that we've already set, that aren't forecast, they're targets. So you got to hit them. So
yeah, absolutely. Another question is around what the priorities are. So we have the Asia Pacific chapter now live, part of that global network. Mark, if I could come to you, are there 1 or 2 things that you're really hoping to achieve as a sort of individually, as a member of the network, as a group of CFOs? And also, is there any area that you're really looking to others for support to help achieve progress?
Yeah, well, I'm definitely looking for the others for support and ideas and things, because there's I think there's a lot of creativity out there. But one thing that I think it's important is, we're just sort of getting underway around standardizing and harmonizing some of the reporting, because I think the comparability is going to be really important. And it's also important that we kind of try to keep this as simple as it can be, but as complex as it needs to be, sort of, right? And finding that balance. So I think that would be quite important, is to kind of settle on a set of standards that we can deliver, and that provides meaningful information and guidance, for us to make decisions on. And then the other, I think, is just to sort of bring as many industries and different perspectives into the group as possible, because I think very often it's funny how your mind sort of gets jogged, by looking at analogs in completely different settings, and makes you look at a problem, quite differently, and maybe through that make some progress, So yes, I think having some additional industries in the group would be great.
Rishi, how about you? Any key for areas of focus that you're keen to look at?
Yeah, so Jessica, I think, like I was saying earlier on, now finance and sustainability is really intertwining and very strongly. And there are enough risk and opportunities to look out for. And finance will have to play a very strong leadership role. Within that perspective, the APAC chapter coming together, it really brings a mix of geographies and learnings across this region. It is a fairly diverse region. It is unlike probably the Americas, which is still within one place, or Europe, while continent is very much similar. There's similar thinking, but the region in APAC is very diverse and dispersed. So we will have to contend with differential understanding and also expectations. But the good part is, like Martin was also saying earlier, that the journey is the same. So when one would come to this part of the world, in London specifically or Europe, the focus is very much different and heightened. But the journey is the same now. It is just that the starting points could be different. So I think we'll have to draw out our own balances, understand where we stand, and then chart our own journey going forward individually and for the chapter overall, is how I see this. But there is so much learning that already exists, which will actually benefit us. The good part is we don't need to reinvent the wheel. Most of the long yards and the hard work has already been done. We can lean on the learnings and then adapt to what we need for our own situations, is how I see it.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that is one of the things that'll be really, really exciting. And I guess connecting that to the point Mark was saying, often that cross-sectoral learning is where some of the really big innovations can actually come those strides forward. I think similarly, in terms of such a diverse set of regions, I think there are going to be some really exciting opportunities in terms of different perspectives, different thinking, different solutions that can help everyone to really leap forward. Shay, how about you? Are there one or two things that you're really excited about in terms of the areas of focus?
Yeah, I think aside from us learning from each other and incorporating the best practices that the organizations are actually going to share in MPIC, I'd probably like to maybe explore all of us doing collaborative programs for a more pervasive impact. As I always say, sustainability is a collective responsibility, right? The good things that we do in our respective organizations, in our respective countries, redound to the borderless impact for everyone. Maybe we can probably do something on addressing climate change, maybe work with, say, the ASEAN Center for Biodiversity in its various ecosystem programs. Imagine the bigger and pervasive impact we will all have, right, as a group, versus if we were to do things individually in our respective companies, in our respective countries.
Thank you. Yeah, no, I agree. And I think some of the issues faced, there's no way that any one organization can come up with the solutions. Martin, I'll come to you next, and I'd like any additional thoughts around that impact, but then also if there's one action, which I know is always a challenging question, that you think will really have the biggest impact over the next 12 months. What is that? And then I'll come to everyone else with that same question.
Yeah, well, I think to the previous point, just, like everything in life, taking the first step is the hardest. And just doing that for us, I think is a good thing, and looking forward to doing the maturity assessment that you're going to put us through, and so we can learn from that and from, like Rishi was saying, learning from all the hard work that's already been done. So I think hopefully we can catch up quicker than other chapters. In terms of the one major thing, I think for us at Ramsay, given the fact that in Australia, a lot of our hospitals use a lot of energy, and the grid in Australia is a long way behind where it is in Europe in terms of renewable energy. We're very much a coal-powered country. Rolling out solar energy across our business in Australia, and my role in championing that and funding it is probably going to be the biggest thing for us in terms of climate change over the next 12 months. We've got a lot of roof space, and it's very hot. There's lots of sunshine, so we should be able to make an impact there with rolling out solar. That's one of our key sustainability targets that we've got to hit, and so that's going to be one of the biggest things, I think, for us over the next 12 months, I'd say. Great,
thanks, Martin. Shay, how about you?
I think for MPIC, it would have to be our focus on nature-based solutions and trying to protect, the environment. and us continuing our heeding the need for climate action. Because as you know, the Philippines is one of the top countries affected by climate change, right? That's according to the Global Climate Risk Index. But despite this, we are actually blessed with the many natural resources that can also help fight climate change. So I think we have to do our part in making sure our natural ecosystems and biodiversities are protected. And biodiversity losses are also curbed and halted, because our ability to be able to survive and thrive, not just in our respective businesses and as humanity, is really hinged on nature, right? Nature can survive and reboot by itself without us, but unfortunately, we cannot survive without nature. So again, for us, we will have to fortify our environmental stewardship programs with our sustainability-linked advocacies involving many communities, because these communities also depend on natural resources in their day-to-day life.
Thank you. Yeah, and that whole question of nature, we're in the process of updating some of our guidance, but as again Pavan and touched on earlier, and I think in the chat, a lot of guidance out there, but really a huge amount of work to do in terms of finding solutions. Mark, how about you?
Yeah, well, I think probably the most important thing, I think, is that we learn to think holistically, and kind of systems thinking is something that we're not necessarily trained to do from the beginning. But I think we have to get used to thinking that way. How is one thing connected to another, and how does reducing one area impact all the other things? So, for example, in our business, maybe reducing water usage, for example, has multiple benefits. It'll reduce the amount of wastewater we have to treat. That requires less energy, and then that reduces operating costs. And then suddenly it's easier to switch to renewables energy sources and things like that. So just how things are connected together as a discipline of systems thinking and thinking holistically.
Fantastic. And then finally, Rishi, the last thought to you before I think we'll then sadly be out of time. So.
Yeah, no, I think as we said it, I think all my co-panelists have said it and very eloquently. It is really about the chain that we'll all have to drive together, and which is the journey that we are on. And I'm fairly hopeful, and over the past many years, we've all been seeing this change come through. But where we stand today, I think I'm more positive than ever in where this is headed and how we can all come together to make it happen. Really. So very positive and very energized by what I'm hearing across the panelists too.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much, Rishi, and to Shay, Mark and Martin. We're just about out of time, so I'm afraid huge apologies if we didn't have a chance to cover all of your questions during the discussion. We have got 5 more sessions over the rest of the day, and what we will make sure that we pick up on some of the themes covered by the panelists during those deep dive sessions, but also any of your questions, we'll also see if we can tackle some of those. A number on reporting, on remuneration, on the kind of metrics and measures that the government can use as well.